everyone. I'm Joe Pryweller, Conference Director for Plastics News. Welcome to this session of Ask the Expert, your chance to engage with professionals on a range of topics and to interact with questions. Today's Ask the Expert is sponsored by Shale Crescent USA. Our experts are Greg Kozera, Director of Marketing with Shale Crescent USA, and Joe Eddy, President and CEO of Enhanced Technologies. Greg and Joe will offer guidance on how to increase your profitability by connecting energy, petrochemicals, and manufacturing. Greg and Joe will answer your questions after the presentation. To submit a question, email pnevents@crane.com, or if you're watching along on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, submit your questions via those platforms. With that, I will turn things over to Greg Kozera and Joe Eddy. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be back again. Shale Crescent USA is a regional nonprofit marketing, research, and economic development organization. Our mission is to bring jobs to the Shale Crescent region, which is Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The summer before the pandemic, we were visiting a processor in the region, and he was working on using plastic, waste plastic, as part of his resin stream. As a matter of fact, it's working out real well for him. One of the questions I asked him, I said, Bob, tell me something. What would it mean to you if you could order your resin on Monday and have it here by Friday? And he said, Kozera. He said, do you see those 5 silos out there? He said, they're full of resin. He said, that doesn't count when I got riding the rails between the Gulf Coast and here. He said, if I could get my resin in a week, I wouldn't need all that inventory. He said, do you have any idea how much money I've got tied up just in inventory that I could avoid? Next slide, please. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about reliability, particularly your supply chain. We're going to talk about profitability, and we're going to talk about sustainability. Next slide, please. What we want to focus on is what's changed, what are the opportunities, and how you can take advantage of those opportunities. Next slide, please. In our last live stream, we talked about this. One of the big changes has been, first, the U.S. being a major energy producer in oil and natural gas, but where that energy is produced is really important. And right today, as we speak, 85% of the new natural gas being produced in the United States is in the Shale Crescent region of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. This little region of the country, which is smaller than Texas, is now producing 35% of the United States gas supply. That's a big deal. And it's also producing a large part of the natural gas liquids and a growing percentage of that. And that's important too, because the natural gas liquids are the feedstock for the resins that processors use. Next slide, please. The United States is now a global energy leader. And we are the #1 oil and natural gas producer in the world. Russia's #2. And Shale Crescent USA, and that's without the rest of the USA, is #3. This little area of the country, West Virginia and Pennsylvania, is if it was a country, it would be the #3 natural gas producer in the world. That's a big deal, but here's a bigger deal. Next slide, please. China is a major competitor of ours, and what China needs is oil and natural gas. They need feedstock, they need energy, and this little part of the country, Shale Crescent USA, is producing almost twice as much natural gas as the entire country of China. Next slide, please. What's really changed is the local resin supply. We've never had a local resin supply for decades. In 1920, the first cracker was built in Clendenin, West Virginia. Starting next year, in 2022, the Shale cracker in Monaca, PA, is going to begin to produce polyethylene. That's huge, and that's huge in a lot of different ways. But they're going to be producing 3.5 billion pounds of resin a year from that cracker. And that's just the first of what we think will be several in the region. PTT they haven't announced yet, but there's a lot of work going on that site. We've got several other crackers that we expect to see at least 2 more in this region. But what does just Shell alone, what does that mean for the region, particularly for processors? The U.S. produces about 50 billion pounds of resin annually. So 3.5 billion starting next year will be coming from this cracker. That's a big deal because it's unaffected by hurricanes and the freeze like we saw in Texas. That won't happen up here because just the nature of the beast of this region. Next slide, please. The other thing that's really changed is the market proximity now. 80% of the demand for petrochemicals is within a day's drive of Shale Crescent, USA. 70% of the polyethylene demand, 77% of polypropylene demand, and half the United States population, the people that consume the products that processors make, is within a day's drive. And this is the first time that we've ever had the demand, the consumers, the processors, and energy and feedstock all in one area. And that's big from a transportation standpoint and a cost-saving standpoint. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities for you? That's really what this is all about. Joe Eddy is an executive consultant, and he's the retired CEO of Eagle Manufacturing. And Joe's going to talk more about that. So, Joe, you're on.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Plastics News, for presenting this platform for us to talk about, plastics processors' opportunities for growth. As you know, Greg just very eloquently laid out some of the things that have changed in the United States and in the markets, in the energy more specifically. I'm going to talk about today the opportunities. What are the opportunities for us to, as plastics processors and as manufacturing, what are the opportunities for us to take back lost market share? What is that lost market share and what created it? As well as how do we bring back jobs to the United States that have been lost? So with that, I think it's easy to say, if you look at the little tag in the lower corner of this slide, made in the USA, okay? We can make things here. We've always been good at it, and that's a big part of the opportunity that we have. Let's look at the next slide. A little bit of a busy slide. My background is petroleum engineering, and as the CEO for a long, long time at Eagle Manufacturing, a large plastics processor, these things are all near and dear to my heart. Manufacturing, energy, plastics. So I often have the opportunity for Shale Crescent USA to talk about these things because I've experienced them. Not sure it makes me an expert, but as far as having a long time of 40 years of experience, that's why I like to talk about it. So as you can see here, this slide starts in 1946, but going clear back to 1900 effectively, with the growth in oil and natural gas, we've also had the opportunity to grow our manufacturing jobs through the Industrial Revolution and on through the Information Revolution and into the Energy Revolution again now. So with that, manufacturing jobs have effectively always mirrored production of natural gas and oil in the United States. So I like to say that the two industries are mutually dependent upon each other, and that has always been the case. And as you see here, as oil and gas production increased through the early 70s, so did the manufacturing jobs in the United States, peaking at about 20 million jobs in the 1970s, and then starting a little bit with the production decreases of oil and natural gas, the manufacturing jobs started reducing through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, holding steady for a while, but effectively not growing until 2001. And the big change there that I'm going to talk a little bit further about through this presentation is China and what happened. China entered the World Trade Organization, and from that point forward, as you can see on this slide, we had a major free fall of U.S. manufacturing jobs. And we'll look at the next few slides, not yet, but the other point I wanted to make is we hit a trough right at the front end of our energy revolution again in 2010 of only 11.5 million manufacturing jobs in this country. So we lost an incredible amount of jobs. And a large part of that was due to China entering the World Trade Organization. Direct correlations, and we'll look at it again here shortly. The thing that I said, as energy increases in the United States, so do manufacturing jobs. And since we've had the energy revolution, and mainly in the Shale Crescent region that Greg talked about, we've added 1.4 million additional new manufacturing jobs in the United States. So let's look at the next slide, and we'll tie all this together. It's easy to see the correlation, as I talked about, with U.S. manufacturing jobs lost and with China's import growth into the United States with products. This started again in 2001, but over the last 35 years, we have literally imported $7 trillion of products and finished goods and products and other materials, $7 trillion from China, with most of that being since they entered the World Trade Organization. So again, a direct correlation, and most of that since the World Trade Organization changed. So let's look at the next slide. What does that mean today? China now is averaging over $500 billion per year of trade imports from China into the U.S. So let's look at that, and those are all products not made in the United States that could be. So let's look at what that means for plastic processing opportunities. Next slide, please. U.S. plastic imports of that 500 billion, and again, that's just from China's imports, okay? But of total imports into the United States, $45 billion of plastic products, and again, that's plastic only products. There's a lot of additional plastic included in other parts and products and automobiles and things that's not incorporated into this statistic, but $45 billion per year of specifically plastic products imported into the United States. Of that, the interesting thing is that about 60% or $28 billion comes directly from China and other near Asian countries. So again, I'm focusing on that for a lot of reasons, but China, I think, is our low-hanging fruit, and I'm going to talk about why that might be the case. But again, lots of potential products, market share to recapture, as well as manufacturing jobs. And that's the target, and I think we're at an incredible time period to take advantage of the challenges. And you've heard me say this before, and it's definitely a belief within the Shale Crescent USA group that the largest challenges always present the best opportunities for growth and change. And that China, as we all know, has been a challenge for those that have taken advantage of moving manufacturing offshore and moving to China or other Asian countries to manufacture. It's time, and we'll talk in a little bit about it's time to bring those manufacturing jobs back, and we have that opportunity today. So let's look at a couple of other reasons other than what Greg covered at the next slide here. The other opportunities, and we talked a little bit about this in the first session. I want to expand upon it because there's some additional new information that we want to cover. If you look at the slide, Chinese manufacturing earnings, what's happened to their Chinese labor rates? What was once an enormous manufacturing cost advantage in China over the US is no longer valid. Most of that is particularly due to their increases in Chinese labor costs. So as well as US growth in productivity. Okay, so there's been a cost increase in China for labor, U.S. has had significant productivity increases over and above what China has. So those two things together have really made a difference and brought parity to the comparison manufacturing cost indices. You look at this slide, and it's significant in the fact that in the last 20 years, Chinese wage rates have doubled every 4 to 5 years for an effective tenfold, that's 10 times increase in labor rates. And they're continuing to increase as the middle class living style and everything is changing, and new demands, and they're having to implement some regulatory now, that they really have never had. So those cost increases continue to move forward and make us definitely more competitive. So let's look at the next slide and expand on this. Another major savings increase, especially for plastics processors and manufacturers in general, being a energy intensive industry, and even more specific to the plastics processors. Let's look at some examples of U.S. and more specifically Ohio's industrial electricity rates. On a comparison basis, Ohio right now averages 5.75 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. The Zhejiang province in China averages 9.5 cents, and in some regions like the U.S. it's higher. Some might be a little lower, but in general, we have what I would say may not be completely new, but we do have an ever increasing imbalance in our benefit for electricity costs, especially in the center of the Shale Crescent USA region. So with that, and with manufacturing being energy intensive, this gives us another major benefit, because electricity is one of the top cost factors in plastics processing. So again, labor and the energy intensity and electricity rates. Let's look at the next slide. So with the renewed energy advantage that Greg discussed, a tenfold increase in Chinese labor rates over the last 20 years, and very competitive U.S. Electricity rates, especially here in the center of Shale Crescent USA. What used to be 30% manufacturing cost advantage for China 20 years ago has eroded to parity today. That is of major importance. And so now I think it's important to also consider, if you look at the inputs for this, it's labor, electricity, natural gas, supply, and it says other. But let's talk about some of the things that are the major cost components that may not be considered here when we talk about the ability to compete. The index does not consider raw material cost advantages. Again, those are often changing depending on the feedstock and supply and where China is getting their plastics for processing, as well as the raw materials that are feeding that feedstock, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or other parts of the Middle East. As well as it does not include their ability to be able to support products without a large transportation cost like we can in the U.S., especially when they're supplying U.S. markets with imports. So again, the basic feedstock and energy advantage from the feedstocks as well as transportation gives us additional advantages. So with that, let's say that we all know now that we can compete with China, and we can compete economically and profitably. But let's look at the next slide and talk about what else I think that's really important, especially with ESG goals that we have now that, are goals, but will someday possibly be mandated by our markets, by our customers, by the governments and regulatory. But let's look at the fact that we can now not only be profitable, but we can be sustainable. And I think that is on a competitive advantage and things to talk about and market. That is a great opportunity for us. So we're all today, as processors and as manufacturers and business people, working to eliminate transportation, working, let me back up, say today we're all working to improve our processes to mitigate emissions as part of our ESG programs. What would we all say, and what would it mean to us if we could say we could eliminate these emissions completely by eliminating the transportation of this $45 billion of imported plastic products per year, let alone the 500 billion of total imports from China per year. But if we focus on the plastics processing, it's a huge, huge number. So let's look at the next slide, and we'll take a look at the what I'm talking about here. In China, for example, as Greg said, not producing a lot of their own raw materials. They're importing raw materials. They're importing, if it's not oil and natural gas to make product, it's importing resin. There's oil and raw materials, ocean transport of 7,000 to 10,000 miles. We tried being very conservative on this. There's 10 to 15,000 miles of ocean transport for the containers of shipping either raw materials or finished products. There's inland, and again, what I'm saying here is if China's producing the plastic products, they have time and cost and transportation to get their raw materials there to make the products. Then they have to ship those products back across ocean waters and across land inland to the United States to get it to the central markets of the US. There is as much as 25,000 miles of ocean and land transport to move that raw materials, resins, and then finished products to market if they're importing it here into the United States. So, or if they're exporting and we're importing. So that's at least 25,000 miles of carbon footprint and transportation emissions, huge carbon footprint. So the easiest and largest reduction in carbon emissions for a consumer products company is to make the product here in the United States and have, if it's made in the middle of the Shale Crescent USA region, only to have 500 miles as a maximum transportation cost and emission footprint. So major reduction, something that should be being talked about more in government and policy, but definitely I think it's time that we start talking more about what Greg emphasized, and I think we'll say again before this presentation's over, the importance of understanding why Shale Crescent USA is the only place in the world where you can manufacture your products, place your manufacturing plant right in the middle of your energy supply, right on top of your raw materials, and right in the middle of the largest market for these products in the world. So if you look at that and understand and realize the fact that we can be competitive, profitable, and sustainable all at the same time, I think that it's really important as CEOs, as manufacturing leaders, and more specifically plastics processing leaders, that you understand that it's time that we change and have a paradigm shift here. Very important. We need to change the narrative and realize and start talking to our employees, our customers, and to our government officials the fact that we change this narrative in our thinking process to know that we can be profitable. We can compete with China, and not only profitably, but sustainably. And what does that sustainability mean? It means a major reduction in carbon emissions and a carbon footprint. And it really is a good adder that we have the ability to bring back these jobs to the United States, as well as the ability to make products now profitably. And with that, I want to say that, Greg's going to talk a little bit about where we're going with this in June. And we're going to expand on this, talk about what those specific opportunities are, and break it down and strip it down and peel off the layers and say, okay, if you're in this type of a processing market, these are the opportunities and the products that have the best opportunity for you. Or if you use this type of resin, these are the type of opportunities that you have. So in a short presentation that we have today, it's hard to break that down and to get into the specifics, but that's where we're really leading with this. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Greg Kozera, and Greg will talk a little bit about where we're going in June with this. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Joe. What we've done today has been, ladies and gentlemen, been a very high level. We would be happy to visit with any of you individually and talk about specifically what this means to your organization. We've done several studies, and we're happy to share that information with you. And we don't charge fees for anything we do. Shale Crescent is going to be at its first in-person event since the pandemic. We're going to be at the West Virginia Manufacturers Association conference in Morgantown, West Virginia on June 7th and 8th. So if you're in the region, you want to come visit us there, that'd be great. We're going to be back here on live stream June 16th, and we're going to talk about how you can be sustainable and more profitable. So look forward to seeing everybody back then. And Joe Pryweller, back to you, sir. Thank you.
Perfect presentation, Greg and Joe, and sounds like there's some good news there about how we can compete with China in manufacturing. So that's terrific. I want to remind our audience too that if you'd like to ask questions, you can do so by sending your questions to pnevents@crane.com, or if you're watching along on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, you can send questions in through those platforms too, and we'll get to those in the order that they are received. Let's start by talking a little bit about China and some of the areas that Joe got into. Greg and Joe, what is Shale Crescent USA's greatest advantage over China? What do you see as, if you could pinpoint something there?
I think I would say, Joe, that this is the markets here. We've got half the U.S. population, so the people that are buying stuff, most of them are here. The processors, the people that can make the stuff are here. So really the location, I think, is huge, where you've got energy, feedstock, and customers all in one spot.
Excellent. Joe, do you have anything to add there?
No, just Greg sums it up pretty well. And I think that's a great statement, because there aren't too many places, maybe no other places in the world where any manufacturer or processor can do that. Other than, in the middle of the Shale Crescent USA. But I think there's two things, we referenced them today. Part of it's, I think, a natural effect of the growth in China, and that is labor rate increases have really made us competitive, more competitive on a manufacturing cost index basis. But even more so, the energy revolution that we've seen here over the last 10 years has really given us a great shot in the arm going forward for the next 20 to 30, 40 years with the reserves of natural gas liquids, all of our heating and processing and feedstocks that we literally have here that we're, as Greg noted, we used to have an advantage in the 20s and 30s and 40s. We lost that with the manufacturing or with the reduction in production. It's back, and we do have an opportunity. I'll tell you, it's up to us as leaders to take advantage of this opportunity, because if we don't, and we don't take advantage of it now, I don't know where the profitability and sustainability of our manufacturing jobs and our markets will be in the next 20 years. I think it's an imperative process for us, again, as leaders, to realize that we are competitive. We can be competitive and profitable and more sustainable. So, yeah, I think that's our greatest advantage over China. And again, there's a lot of reasons that we pinpoint China as our biggest advantage and opportunity. It is because that's where our market share has been lost over the last 20 years. So, yeah, that's a great question, Joe. Thank you.
Sure, Joe, I can add something else that might be important.
Greg.
We talked to executives. One of the things that we heard is what used to take 30 days to get here from places like Asia are taking 70 plus. and it's coming at an increased cost. Not to mention the fact that right now, I was on a conference and they're showing all these ships floating around in the Pacific Ocean waiting to be able to unload. So it's just shipping across the ocean isn't exactly what it used to be.
No, I was going to say, I imagine that there's a big cost differential. It's growing for shipping something overseas, obviously compared to shipping it from the Shale Crescent region of the United States. It must be, you see that growing quite a bit because of shipping issues and that kind of thing. And
well, yeah, shipping issues as well as port issues in the United States. The ports are backed up. The ports and infrastructure are not, they need to be updated. It's a major cost increase to import the product. So that's a major benefit for us. That's why I say this is the time to take advantage of these opportunities.
Great. And a follow-up question. And again, if you want to send your questions, send them to pnevents@crane.com or via your LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube sites, and we'll get to those. A follow-up question to what's going on with manufacturing moving here. Do you see also a movement taking place already to more regional supply chains instead of global supply chains?
Greg, you want to touch on that? My answer is definitely. That's a great question as well. There is a move. There are some things like the pandemic that really have broadened our horizons on why that is of issue. But regional supply chains, again, carry all these same things we're talking about: less cost, less working capital costs, as Greg noted, with the Shell cracker in Monaca, PA, coming online in June of 2022.
Right.
I'd give you that covers what you just talked about, and that is whether it's imported products or even raw materials. I mean, Greg's discussion about Bob's comment about the 5 silos and rail cars, that's something that we definitely live at Eagle daily. We are about the same thing. We have 4 million pounds of resin storage capacity on site and 20 rail cars on our sidings. Wow. And with that capacity, we have to do that, even though we bring it from Houston, Texas, because of potential disruptions with weather and different things. So this is discussing about China, but the regional supply is becoming more and more important for cost, sustainability, and reliability, as Greg noted early in one of the earlier slides. So that's definitely going to be a must. Greg, you want to expand on?
I think the pandemic, Joe, showed us the vulnerability. Sometimes it takes an event that shows our weaknesses and shows how we're vulnerable. And I think the pandemic did that in so many different ways. We had companies shut down here because they were getting maybe one product from China. Well, that one product shut a whole supply chain down. So I think when we start thinking regionally, and we're starting to see companies in this region start to think that way, knowing that they don't want to see that happen again.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I'm going to put you on a spot a second, Joe. You mentioned that we need to change the narrative, and maybe even government policy needs to change a little bit, or as a way to get this across to companies or to consumers even about manufacturing here instead of China. How do we do that kind of thing? What are some of the action steps or next steps you see to change that narrative?
Yeah, I think we're trying to do that with education right now. Greg references the fact that at Shale Crescent, we fund and implement studies. That's really effectively why we're doing this specific plastics study, so that we can educate, our legislators, for example. We're not a lobbying group, that we're all very sensitive to that. But we offer this, to industry and to policymakers, this information to educate them and to get them more engaged, so that they will understand the importance of this for the long-term benefit of our country. I mean, it's not just companies' profitability here. We're talking about the long-term livelihood and the fact that, the big changes that have made, it's one of the reasons I always say it took us so long to come out of the 2008 and 9 recession, because we had 8.5 million less manufacturing jobs at that point than we did 10 to 20 years earlier. manufacturing jobs, plastic processors, steel manufacturing, whatever it is, are really the fastest way to generate wealth and build wealth in any country, in any society. Without those manufacturing jobs, we saw, instead of a 2 or 3 or 4 year recovery, which had been historic norms, we had a 10-year recovery coming out of that recession. So let's say maybe not a 10, but a 5-year, we were recovering through that. But that's the issue, and why it's so important policy-wise for the policymakers to understand. So, Greg, you might want to expand on that. But yes, Joe, my number one thing is to say these platforms that you're offering give us the ability to inform and educate, our own industries, because I think that's where it starts in every state. We need more people to talk about this, but educating our industry so they understand it and what our opportunities are, and then to talk to our legislators, state and federal.
Amen.
Okay.
Yeah. Sounds good. We'll end there, but I want to see if I want to ask either of you if you have any final comments you want to leave the audience with before we end the conversation here. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with before we, besides telling about the June 16th webinar that's our Ask the Expert session that's coming up? Anything else you want to leave the audience with?
Greg, go ahead if you want to.
I think one of the things that when we start thinking about sustainability, I think we need to broaden our view of that. And we're going to talk about that in June, because there's more than one way to get this job done. And there's a way to get it done that we've found that you can actually be more profitable and do a better job of taking care of the environment. And that's really good. I think it's going to be really an eye opener for a lot of processors.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, with that, I want to thank Greg Kozera of Shale Crescent USA and Joe Eddy of Enhanced Technologies for sharing us their thoughts on enhancing your profitability and really what's going on in China, how we can be more competitive. We can lower that $45 billion of imported plastic products that are coming to the United States for sure. If you have additional questions for Greg and Joe, please feel free to reach out to them directly. Their email addresses are on the screen. They'll be glad to talk to you one-on-one about what they talked about today, or anything dealing with working with the Shale Crescent region of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. As Greg noted, we have one more Ask the Expert session scheduled for June 16th, and we'll get into a little more about how companies can be profitable and sustainable at the same time, and how to change some of that narrative that we talked about today. Today's Ask the Expert session will be available for viewing on the events section of Plastics News website, so you can look for it there. I'm Joe Pryweller with Plastics News. We'll end with a short message from Shale Crescent USA. I'll see you at a future Ask the Expert session.